Welcome to English Mirror. This is the second part of Humanist literary theory. Today we analyze Philip Sidney, Francis Bacon, Joseph Addison, Edmund Burke, Samuel Johnson, and Joshua Reynolds. Sir Philip Sidney, 1554 to 1586. England, although it could boast an important emergent literary tradition, starting in the Middle Ages with Chaucer, didn't make any significant contribution to literary theory until the second half of the 16th century, when Sir Philip Sidney wrote an apology for poetry in 1583. His impassioned defense of poetic art came as a response to an attack on poetry by a Puritan critic who followed Plato in arguing that poetry was a waste of time, that it was based on lies, and that it taught sinful things. Sidney's discussion of poetry follows in the path laid out by Horace, insisting that the art serves the dual purpose of instruction and pleasure. Poesy, therefore, is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termed it in his word mimesis, that is to say, a representation, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture with its end to teach and delight. Poetry, according to Sidney, provides a vehicle for instructing readers in the proper ways to be, think, act, believe, and do, just as much as sermons or histories, and it has the advantage over these drier forms of providing enjoyment while it teaches. He answers the Puritan accusations that poetry is the mother of all lies by following Aristotle's logic. If poetry were merely an imitation of nature, it would be necessarily an inferior copy, hence, a form of falsehood. But if poetry is an act of creation, then it completes a process that nature leaves incomplete and partial by teaching us the inner meaning of the things and events of the external material world. The mimetic quality of poetry, rather than presenting an inferior world, in fact presents a higher level of reality. Sir Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626. Sir Francis Bacon, a contemporary of Sidney and Shakespeare, also follows Aristotle rather than Plato in insisting that poetry does not present an inferior imitation of the real world, but rather that it presents a world that is better than the one we live in. The Advancement of Learning, published in 1605, Bacon argues that history, fact, and reason are necessarily tied to human experience and can only present the world as it is known to our senses. Bacon argues that imagination unchained by the limitations of sensory perception or actual experience, can create realities not yet manifested. Bacon says that poetry can present a feigned history which, far from being a dangerous lie, can speak directly to the human soul and not just to the rational mind. Bacon concludes poetry has some participation of divineness because it can and does raise and erect the mind by submitting the show of things to the desires of the mind, whereas reason by itself doth buckle and bow the mind unto the nature of things. For Bacon, poetry is greater than rationality because reason can only observe the pre existing material world, not alter it. Poetry allows the mind to create its own worlds and to rule over them. Joseph Addison, 1672 to 1719. In On the Pleasures of the Imagination, three essays in The Spectator, published in June 1712, Addison explores the question of how poetry creates pleasure. He is concerned with how a literary work affects its reader, though unlike Plato, he is less concerned with the moral effect of a poem than with its aesthetic effect. He is interested more in how a poem delights than in how or what it instructs. Following the mental philosophy or psychology of John Locke, Addison describes two kinds of pleasure in imagination. Primary pleasure comes from the immediate experience of objects through sensory perception. Secondary pleasure comes from the experience of ideas, from the representation of objects in words or pictures when those objects are not present. He distinguishes the powers of the imagination from the powers of reason, noting that while reason investigates the cause of things, imagination is content with experiencing them, either directly or through representations. The imagination is less refined than the faculty of reason and provides pleasure from observation of the obvious rather than from probing hidden causation. The pleasures of imagination are thus more easily acquired than those of reason and are more widely available to untrained minds. Addison agrees with Sidney and Bacon that art is not just an imitation of nature, but an improvement on or completion of it. He points out that the secondary pleasure of imagination makes it possible for an experience which would be disagreeable in actuality to be represented in pleasurable form. Edmund Burke, 1729 to 1797. Burke follows John Locke in starting with the idea that all human knowledge comes from sensory experiences. Burke describes imagination as the capacity to create complex ideas through the combination of the simple ideas gathered through the senses. Imagination is a creative power that works in two ways. to represent images of nature in the manner in which the senses originally perceived them, and to combine these images in new ways. Burke insists that the imagination cannot achieve wholly original creations. It only combines and reshapes the sensory perceptions the mind receives. But imagination is not tied to the natural world. Art, for Burke, is not an imitation or copy of the natural world, but is itself a kind of recreation. In a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, published in 1757, Burke argues with Plato's idea that the artist is merely a copier, making imitations of the natural world, and the critical standard that judges art on the accuracy of its imitation of an existing object. Burke suggests that the critical assessment of art should be based on the idea of taste, the conception of what one wants a representation to do. Taste is a matter of sensibility, according to Burke, rather than a question of reason and logic. He believes that sensibility is more common than reason, since reason requires education and training, but that sensibility can be developed to a greater or lesser degree in individuals. For Burke, different viewers get different kinds of pleasure from different kinds of mimetic representations. Samuel Johnson, 1709 to 1784. Johnson's essay on fiction, appearing in the Rambler on March 31st, 1750, marks the beginnings of literary criticism of forms other than poetry and drama. Discussions of fiction appear in the middle of the 18th century, following the rise of the novel as an important literary form. Fiction depends on the idea of mimesis, presenting stories which imitate nature or real life. Unlike poetry or drama, however, fiction depends on the principle of realism, presenting stories of individuals to readers as if these individuals were real people. The realism of fiction blurred the distinction between the imagined world of art and the real world of history and biography. Fiction also depended on using language that aimed for transparency. Johnson follows Plato in insisting that criticism of literature, especially fiction, has to be based on an assessment of its moral effect. Novels are potentially more harmful than poetry because novels are the more realistic form. The realism of fiction, according to Johnson, also ties the genre more closely to the actualities of human existence because they do not contain the wild strain of imagination of poets and do not rely on supernatural or inexplicable events. Fiction comes from authors who have direct knowledge of human nature, gained through intercourse with other humans. A novelist copies easily recognizable events and characters. Johnson argues any reader can judge the accuracy of the representation and evaluate a novel according to that standard. The rule of realism should be bent, according to Johnson, so that novels deviate from nature whenever it is necessary to present the proper outcome where wickedness is punished and virtue rewarded. Johnson argues that the ancient Greek and Roman writers presented the best models for any literary art. Those works which have withstood the test of time have proved themselves useful. Sir Joshua Reynolds, 1723 to 1792. Sir Joshua Reynolds was an 18th century painter. His Discourses on Art, published in 1797, though they focus on painting, present ideas about representation which were central to the discussions of literary aesthetics and criticism going on during this period. Reynolds follows Plato in arguing that the highest and soundest kind of art and of criticism refers to an eternal, immutable nature of things, a kind of universal ideal common to all times and all forms of art. The purpose of criticism, then, is to discover the beauties and faults in particular works of art and artists with reference to this universal ideal. But Reynolds laments critics are mortal, and thus their assessments of art are subjective, not immutable or eternal. Reynolds concluded, is to try to discover the principles of human nature on which all forms of imaginative art, including painting and poetry, are founded, and then to shape a criticism, an aesthetic standard based on those principles. All arts, Reynolds proposes, have in common that they address the sensibility or imagination as opposed to the rational faculty of the human mind. Sensibility is based on one's collected and collective life experiences rather than on the development of the skill of logical argument. According to Reynolds, intuition happens with no conscious mental effort. One can't be trained to feel. Reynolds argues that painting and literature are not strictly mimetic or imitative, and that aesthetic evaluations cannot be based upon the accuracy of a representation. Direct imitations constitute the lowest style or level of art. Refined taste or sensibility is the product of education and practice and exposure to higher forms of art than just accurate imitations. Painting and poetry both try to gratify the natural human propensity to take pleasure. Poetry, for example, uses an artificial language, such as hexameter or pentameter, to improve on the language of common people. The artificiality of art is part of its pleasure, according to Reynolds. The pleasure of poetry or painting comes from its appeal to sensibility. The great end of all art for Reynolds is to make an impression on the human faculties of imagination and sensibility, not on the faculty of reason. The true test of all the arts, and thus the basis for a universal standard of criticism, is not solely whether the production is a true copy of nature, but whether it answers the end of art, which is to produce a pleasing effect upon the mind. Thank you for watching this video.